G.R. Emmons Photography School and creating better images. Today we'll be speaking about f-stops and shutter speed. Shutter speed is a function that takes place inside the camera. When you push the button on the top of the camera, it lets light in so that you can take an image. Now that light that comes in can vary anywhere from a bulb setting, which lets in vast amounts of light, all the way down to 1/2000th of a second, which will allow you to freeze action. Let's take a look at some images that illustrate these different settings. We'll start out by taking a look at bulb, 1 second, half second, quarter second, eighth of a second, and even up to a 15th of a second to give you an idea what this looks like. Some things you should be aware of before you start taking images that have a slow shutter speed. When possible, always use a tripod. In addition, to help minimize camera shake and camera movement, use a self-timer on the camera so that you can press the shutter button and let's say after 10 seconds or 20 seconds or however long your self-timer sets the shoot to happen, it will take the picture after the camera settled down. That will minimize any movement in the camera and only focus on the movement that takes place in front of the lens. This particular image was taken in Vegas, and as you can see, I didn't use a tripod, nor did I use my self-timer. The shutter speed on this was 3 seconds, and to give you an idea of how long 3 seconds actually is, let's take a look at this, and let's say that 3 seconds starts now. That's how long the shutter was open. And during that time, you can see the blur in the background, simply because the camera was not on a tripod. And you can also see the blur in their legs, and that's more from the 3-second shutter speed. So again, for 3 seconds, this is what you get. This image was shot with a tripod. The exposure was 1.3 seconds. And the way this was set up is that this image was zoomed out all the way to 200 millimeters. And at the start of the exposure, I zoomed it back to 18 millimeters. You can see this image is much sharper than the last one we took a look at. And you can also see that some of the images, because there is a little bit more exposure at that wider angle, are even much sharper than that. Now, this is a great way to try out a zoom lens, get some different effects. You can try this in the house with longer exposures, let's say smaller sections of light that might be there. Zoom in, zoom out, and watch the trails of light form. Have some fun with this. Experiment with this and see some of the more exciting images that you can get. Let's take our shutter speed to 1/125th of a second. What this allows us to do with that faster shutter speed is as someone's moving and you take the image, it freezes their motion. So you can see his legs in reasonable sharpness at 1/125th of a second, as opposed to the way that we saw the legs in that first image in Vegas, where at, I believe it was 3 seconds, you could see an amazing amount of movement or amazing amount of blur through the image. So the faster the shutter speed, the greater that you can actually freeze that motion. Here are a few important takeaways from shutter speed. Remember, the faster the action, the faster the shutter speed. It will allow you to freeze action that way. If you want to show movement or blur, the slower the shutter speed. The slower the shutter speed lets more light into the camera, so movement shows as a blur. If you are taking images at night, use the bulb setting. The bulb setting will allow the most amount of light to come into the camera so that you can take images of buildings with lights on. People that are actually passing through a scene will actually become invisible if they're wearing darker clothes. So it's kind of a neat thing to play with. It'll also allow you to take pictures of the moon, star trails. Have some fun with this. Let's move on to f-stop. F-stop controls the depth of field. Now, depth of field is the distance between the nearest and the farthest objects in a scene that appear acceptably sharp in an image. Let's take a look at what that really means. All lenses have f-stops. F-stops can vary across a number of different settings. We're going to look at settings between f2 and f22. At f2 and f2.8, you're going to have a shallow depth of field. What that means is the image that you have focused on is sharp and your background becomes blurred. Works very well in portraits. When you move to an f5.6, your depth of field starts to improve. That background becomes a little bit more sharp. At f8 or f11, this is where the depth of field increases dramatically. Typically for a lens, that is going to be your sharpest area. Even if you move up to f22 or higher, as your depth of field does become sharper, there are times when you develop blurriness around the edges of the image. So in general, f8 and f11 are going to give you the sharpest image possible across the whole area that the camera is showing you. Please keep in mind, these results will vary by the focal length of the lens, the quality of the glass, and the ISO you are using. The focal length of the lens, the higher the focal length, the less depth of field that you have. The quality of glass will give you a more clear image, especially around the edges. And the ISO you are using, the higher the ISO, can give you noise to actually cloud the image up a bit. So keep all that in mind as we go through this particular example. This image is an example of using an f-stop at f22. The lens is a 50mm lens. Again, being a very short lens, it should give you a fairly great depth of field. The thing to think about, though, is the closer that lens is to the object that you're focusing on, the more shallow that depth of field becomes. So there are a couple of things to look at. Now, that being said, with that lens focused on that coffee cup, it becomes very sharp, and the background also becomes sharp. Now, if that lens had been moved back away from that coffee cup, you would be able to absolutely read that writing on the coffee cup very, very clearly. Now, this does not work very well for portraits. It does work great for landscapes. Landscapes with a longer lens, your depth of field becomes more shallow, but remember, you're fairly far away from everything in that image. So what happens is it gives you an overall view of a tack sharp image right across the board. Play with this. Keep this in mind. Use different f-stops. See how that affects how blurry the background is and how sharp the foreground is. Take a series of pictures that start at f2, move to f2.8, 5.6. Try that all the way up the line so you can see for yourself how it affects your images. This image is set up the same as the previous image, same lens, same distances. The only difference is that the f-stop on this is set at f2. Notice the difference. Notice how sharp that image is in the front and how blurry that image is in the background. As an example, if you were taking a portrait, the least exciting part of that image is going to be the background, so it's great to have that blurry. If you move your f-stop to the area of f2 or f1.8, it does that. It becomes nice and blurry and you get a great portrait. So once again, is if you want to keep your front image sharp and your background image blurry, move your f-stop into the area of f2 or f1.8. There are so many things that affect both f-stop and shutter speed. One of the more important things to a quality of the image actually happens to be with the f-stop. Whenever you buy a lens, buy the best glass that you can possibly afford, because that's going to give you the best overall quality, the best blurs, the best sharpness, the best colors. So when you're thinking about purchasing additional equipment, do the best that you can with your budget. It will give you much better images. If you have further questions on f-stops and shutter speed, please feel free to email me at gremmons@gremmonsphotography. And thanks for being with us today.